They called her Grandma, mostly behind her back. But sometimes when Dr. Preston Sterling was feeling particularly cruel, he'd say it right to her face. He'd actually placed a bet, $500, laid down in the staff lounge with a smug grin that stretched across his movie star jawline. He bet that the new trauma nurse, Sarah Miller, wouldn't last a single month at St. Jude's Medical Center. The security camera footage from that Tuesday night, the one the federal investigators would later review, frame by agonizing frame, captured the exact moment the world tilted on its axis. 1 second, Sarah Miller was just a fired employee, a tired, grey-haired woman in her early 50s, clutching a soggy cardboard box containing the remnants of a 20-year career. The next, she was the only person on the Eastern Seaboard that a 4-star general would allow near his dying son. They took her ID badge, handed her the box, and told her she was finished. After 3 tours in Iraq and 4 in Afghanistan, after holding the line between life and death in dusty, blood-soaked tents from Kandahar to Fallujah, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Dusty Miller was fired for insubordination and assaulting a doctor. She thought her life, the quiet, anonymous life she had fought so hard to find, was over. She was wrong. It was just beginning. For 3 weeks, Sarah Miller had been a ghost haunting the pristine, brightly lit corridors of St. Jude's Trauma 1. She moved with a deliberate, plotting pace that drove the younger residents to the brink of insanity. Her hands, when she held a chart or a pen, possessed a faint, rhythmic tremor, a subtle vibration that Dr. Sterling loved to point out. It was nerve damage, a legacy of holding continuous crushing pressure on a young ranger's femoral artery for 6 uninterrupted hours in the back of a bouncing, bullet-riddled Humvee after an IED strike. She had refused evacuation for herself, her fingers locked into a vice grip, whispering encouragement to the boy as his lifeblood tried to escape. The ranger lived, her nerves never fully recovered. Here, at St. Jude's, the tremor was just a sign of age, of incompetence. "Careful with that, Grandma," Sterling had barked just yesterday as she prepared an IV drip. "We wouldn't want those shaky hands to miss the vein." Again. He'd winked at Brittany Moore, a young, pretty nurse who giggled on cue, her eyes wide with adoration for the chief of surgery. Sarah didn't respond. She simply found the vein on the first try, her movements economical and sure, the tremor vanishing the moment her hands had a task. She secured the line with a piece of tape, her face a mask of quiet professionalism. She was used to it. She had come to St. Jude's seeking peace. After decades of screaming over the thwop-thwop-thwop of helicopter rotors and the deafening crack of gunfire, she craved the quiet, antiseptic hum of a modern hospital. She wanted to heal without the constant threat of violence, to use her skills to mend the mundane injuries of civilian life. She needed the pension. The military had taken its toll, and this job, this quiet, unassuming nursing position, was her bridge to a small, quiet house and a garden she dreamed of planting. But she hadn't accounted for Dr. Preston Sterling. He was the son of a congressman, the grandson of the man whose name was carved in granite on the hospital's new surgical wing. He was Harvard-educated, handsome in a sharp, jagged way, and wore his pristine white coat less like a uniform and more like a coronation robe. He treated the nursing staff like a pit crew, there to hand him tools and absorb his frustrations. He particularly despised Sarah. Her quiet competence was an affront to his loud, performative authority. Her age and unassuming appearance didn't fit the sleek modern image he cultivated for his department. She looked, as he'd once loudly declared to a group of fawning residents, like a librarian who took a wrong turn at the Dewey Decimal System and ended up in a war zone. The irony was so thick it was suffocating. "Miller," he snapped, striding into the nurse's station, his Rolex glinting under the aggressive fluorescent lights. "The crash cart on floor 3, the expiration dates on the EpiPens. Check them again." Brenda O'Brien, the charge nurse, looked up from her computer, her face a thundercloud. Brenda was a veteran of a different kind of war, one fought against budget cuts, pandemics, and incompetent administrators. She had arms like a dock worker and a stare that could curdle milk. "She just checked them this morning, Dr. Sterling," Brenda said, her voice flat. "I saw the log." Sterling's smile was a predatory slash. "And I am saying to check them again. Protocol is protocol. We can't have our patients coding because Grandma forgot how to read a label. Is that a problem, Nurse O'Brien?" Brenda's jaw tightened, but she gave a short, sharp shake of her head. She didn't like Sterling, but she knew which battles to fight. This wasn't one of them. Sarah, who had overheard the entire exchange, simply nodded. "On it, Doctor," she said, her voice a low rasp. She pushed herself up from her chair, her movements slow and measured, and headed for the elevators. She didn't look at him. She didn't give him the satisfaction. As she walked away, she heard him laugh, a loud braying sound meant for the entire floor to hear. "See that plotting pace? Drives me insane. Probably forgot where the cart even is." Brittany Moore giggled again. Brenda O'Brien just stared at her screen, her fingers typing with furious controlled clicks. She didn't approve of the hazing, but Miller was odd, too quiet, too slow. In the chaos of a top-tier trauma center, speed was life. Miller's deliberate, almost obsessive-compulsive checking of charts and equipment seemed like a liability, not an asset. Brenda had her own doubts, and she wasn't about to stick her neck out for the weird new nurse who dressed in scrubs 2 sizes too big and wore her graying hair in a bun so severe it looked painful. If you're already hooked by this story of justice, go ahead and hit that like button right now. It really helps us share more stories of everyday heroes who refuse to back down. Now, back to Sarah Miller's story, because what happened next changed everything. The alarm didn't just ring, it screamed. A piercing, insistent klaxon that cut through the sterile hum of the hospital like a physical blow. Code Black. The words flashed on every monitor, a stark, terrifying red. The overhead speakers crackled to life, a woman's voice tight with controlled panic. "Code Black, mass casualty incident, trauma team Alpha to the Bay, ETA 2 minutes. This is not a drill." The atmosphere in the emergency department shifted instantly. The organized chaos of a typical Tuesday night evaporated, replaced by a tense, electric readiness. Nurses and doctors moved with purpose, their faces grim. Trays were laid out, equipment checked. The air crackled with anticipation and dread. Dr. Sterling, who had been loudly recounting a story about his weekend on his father's yacht, straightened his tie and smoothed his white coat. This was his stage. "All right, people, let's look alive," he bellowed, his voice resonating with theatrical authority. "I want 2 residents on standby for triage, Brenda. Get me a full blood workup ready to go. Let's show them why St. Jude's is number 1. Sarah had just finished re-checking the crash cart on the 3rd floor when the alarm sounded. She didn't run. She moved with an efficiency that was often mistaken for slowness. She placed the final item back in its slot, closed the drawer with a firm click, and walked to the elevator, her face a calm, unreadable mask. By the time she reached the trauma bay, the scene was already unfolding. The automatic doors burst open with a pneumatic hiss, shoved aside by 2 grim-faced men in military police uniforms, their hands resting on their sidearms. They flanked a gurney that was being pushed at a dead run by 4 frantic paramedics. On the gurney was a man. He was large, built like a mountain of muscle, and covered in blood. His tactical gear was shredded, soaked in a dark, glistening crimson. An oxygen mask was strapped to his face, but his lips were a terrifying shade of violet. "Navy SEAL Commander, 38 years old," one of the paramedics shouted over the din. "Multiple GSWs to the chest and abdomen. Massive blood loss in the field. We've pushed 4 units of ONEG. BP is 60 over palp. Heart rate is 140 and thready. SATs are dropping. They were 85 in the rig. Now they're in the low 70s. They transferred him to the trauma bed with a practiced, desperate heave. The room exploded into a symphony of controlled chaos. Monitors beeped frantically. Nurses swarmed the patient, cutting away the remains of his uniform, establishing new lines, drawing blood. "Get me a chest tube tray," Sterling commanded, stepping forward. He shone a penlight into the patient's eyes. "Pupils are sluggish, but reactive. Let's get a look at these wounds." He focused on a nasty-looking piece of shrapnel embedded in the commander's neck. Just below the jawline, it was bleeding profusely, pumping a steady, dark rhythm onto the white sheets. "Okay, he's got a jugular bleed," Sterling announced, his voice loud for the benefit of the residents watching from the periphery. "Pressure, get me some gauze, stat. We need to control this bleeding before we do anything else. This is the priority." Sarah stood back, near the wall, her designated place. She wasn't on Trauma Team Alpha. She was just an observer, a ghost, but she wasn't looking at the neck. Her eyes, trained by years of battlefield triage, where the loudest wound is rarely the deadliest, were fixed on the patient's chest and throat. She saw it instantly. The distended veins in his neck, standing out like thick cords. The subtle but unmistakable shift of his trachea pushed several centimeters to the left. She saw the puffiness of the skin on the right side of his chest, a sign of subcutaneous emphysema, air leaking into the tissue, and most importantly, she saw that the right side of his chest wasn't rising at all. Classic signs of a tension pneumothorax. A collapsed lung was pumping air into his chest cavity with every desperate breath, building pressure that was crushing his heart and his good lung. The neck wound was dramatic, but this was the killer. He had seconds, not minutes. "Doctor," Sarah said, her voice quiet but clear. Sterling didn't look at her. He was barking orders, demanding more lap pads, calling for a vascular surgeon. "Not now, Miller." The patient's oxygen saturation monitor screamed a new, more desperate alarm. 65%. His lips were almost black. "Dr. Sterling," Sarah said again, her voice firmer this time. She took a step forward. "Look at his neck. His trachea." Sterling finally whipped his head around, his face a mask of fury. "Are you questioning my triage in the middle of a code black, nurse?" he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "I am trying to stop this man from bleeding out. Get back against the wall before I have you written up for insubordination." The monitor dropped to 60. The patient's eyes rolled back in his head. A resident, a young man named David Cole, looked from the monitor to Sarah, his face pale with uncertainty. He saw what she saw. He just didn't have the courage to say it. Sarah looked at Sterling, who was obsessively focused on the superficial bleeding. She looked at the dying man on the table. She looked at her own hands, the hands that had saved so many lives, now trembling with a mixture of old nerve damage and fresh adrenaline. In that split second, her entire future hung in the balance. Her quiet life, her pension, her job, all of it versus the oath she had taken, not in a brightly lit auditorium, but in a dusty tent with the smell of sand and blood in the air. The patient comes first. Always. The monitor hit 58. It was over. The decision was made. She didn't ask for permission. She moved. It wasn't the slow, plotting pace they were used to. It was an explosion of coiled energy. She moved with the terrifying fluid precision of an apex predator. In 2 steps, she was at the supply cart. Her hand darted out, bypassing the neatly arranged instruments. She grabbed a 14-gauge angiocath, the largest bore needle they had. "What the hell are you doing?" Sterling roared, finally realizing what was happening. "Security! Get her away from my patient!" Sarah ignored him. She was at the bedside. Sterling reached for her to physically shove her away. Sarah didn't even look at him. She dipped her left shoulder, planting her foot, and checked him with a rigid elbow to the chest. It wasn't a push. It was a tactical block, a movement born of countless hours of hand-to-hand combat training. Sterling, all 6'2" of him, stumbled backward, his eyes wide with shock and outrage. a perfect handprint of antiseptic solution on his expensive shirt. He gasped for air, more from wounded pride than actual injury. Sarah's attention was already back on the commander. She placed her left hand on his chest, her fingers finding the landmarks with an instinct that was faster than thought. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. It was a motion she had performed 1,000 times in the back of Blackhawks, in muddy ditches, under the dim red light of a headlamp while bullets whizzed overhead. Her hands were perfectly, utterly still. The tremor was gone. She held the needle like a dart, uncapped it with her teeth, and spat the plastic cap to the floor. "Don't you dare!" Sterling screamed, lunging forward again. But Brenda O'Brien, the skeptical charge nurse, had seen the tracheal deviation. She had seen the look in Sarah's eyes. It was a look she had never seen before, not of a librarian, but of something ancient and absolute. Brenda moved, her solid frame blocking Sterling's path. "Let her work, doctor," she said, her voice a low growl. Sarah plunged the needle into the commander's chest, just above the third rib. She pushed through skin, fat, and muscle until she felt the distinct pop as the needle entered the pleural space. The effect was instantaneous and dramatic. Hiss. A loud, audible rush of air escaped from the catheter, the sound of a tire being violently punctured. It was the sound of trapped pressure releasing, the sound of life returning. The commander's chest, which had been unnervingly still on one side, rose symmetrically with a deep, shuddering gasp. The monitors, which had been screaming a death knell, began to change their tune. The oxygen saturation number, which had bottomed out in the 50s, began to climb. 70, 75, 85, 92. The violet hue of the commander's lips faded to a healthy pink. The frantic beeping of his heart rate slowed from a chaotic tattoo to a strong, steady rhythm. The room was deathly silent, save for the hiss of escaping air and the steady beep of the monitor. Everyone stared. The residents, the nurses, the MPs by the door. They stared at the small, grey-haired woman who had just saved a man's life with a single, perfectly placed needle. Sarah pulled the needle out, leaving the plastic catheter in place, and taped it down. She peeled off her gloves, her hands now trembling violently from the adrenaline dump. She stepped back from the table, her face pale, but composed. She looked directly at the stunned Dr. Sterling, her eyes as cold and grey as a winter sky. "He's stable," she said, her voice flat. "Do your job, doctor." Then a new sound entered the silent room, a weak, raspy whisper from the man on the table. His eyes were open, hazy with pain, but focused. They weren't looking at the handsome, famous doctor who was supposed to be in charge. They were locked on Sarah. He raised one shaking, blood-caked hand, not in a wave, but in a gesture of profound, instinctual respect. It was a slow, deliberate movement, a hand-to-brow salute, a soldier saluting an officer. Then he spoke, his voice barely audible through the oxygen mask. "Dusty," he rasped. "Holy hell, it's really you." The two MPs by the door, who had been watching with tense suspicion, snapped to attention. Their bodies went rigid, their faces slack with disbelief. Brenda O'Brien stared as if Sarah had just grown a second head. Brittany Moore's hands flew to her mouth, a small gasp escaping her lips. Dr. Preston Sterling's handsome face drained of all colour, his jaw hanging open. He looked from the saluting SEAL commander to the quiet, unassuming nurse he had just tried to have removed by security. "What?" he stammered. "What the hell just happened?" Incredible, right? If you want to see more stories where the underdog becomes the hero, subscribe to this channel right now and ring that notification bell. Also, comment below with your best guess about what happens to Dr. Sterling. Because trust me, his downfall is going to be spectacular. Let's continue. 2 hours later, Sarah sat in a plush leather chair that felt more like a vice. The administrative conference room on the top floor of St. Jude's was a world away from the controlled chaos of the trauma bay. Here, the only sounds were the whisper of the climate control and the nervous drumming of fingers on a polished mahogany table. Across from her sat a panel of three. Harold Henderson, the hospital administrator, was a man who seemed to be perpetually sweating, dabbing at his forehead with a silk handkerchief. Beside him, a cold-faced woman from Human Resources read from a file, her voice a monotone drone. And at the head of the table, looking smug and vindicated in a clean suit, sat Dr. Preston Sterling. The commander was stable, upstairs in the ICU. He would live. The neck wound had been superficial. The tension pneumothorax would have killed him in another 90 seconds. None of that mattered in this room. And in conclusion, the HR woman said, closing the file, the charges are gross misconduct, insubordination, and physical assault on an attending physician. Sterling leaned forward, his face a carefully constructed mask of victimhood. She attacked me. She was unstable, hysterical. I was in the process of performing the correct, life-saving procedure when she lost control and assaulted me. Her reckless intervention could have punctured his heart. It was a miracle I was able to stabilize the patient after her episode. It was a breathtaking lie, delivered with the smooth confidence of a man who had never faced a consequence in his life. Harold Henderson wrung his hands, his eyes darting between Sarah and Sterling. He cared about one thing: liability. A decorated Navy SEAL commander nearly dying in his hospital was a nightmare. A nurse assaulting the son of a powerful congressman was a catastrophe. The choice was easy. "Mr. Henderson," Sarah said, her voice quiet, "the patient is stable, isn't he?" Henderson flinched. "That is not the issue, Nurse Miller. The issue is protocol, chain of command. You took matters into your own hands, and you assaulted a doctor. We have a zero-tolerance policy." Sarah looked down at her hands, resting in her lap. The tremor was back, a fine rhythmic dance of her fingertips. "I did my job," she whispered. Sterling scoffed. "Your job is to follow orders, my orders. You are finished in this hospital. In any hospital. I'll see to it your license is revoked." Sarah finally lifted her head, and her eyes met Henderson's. There was no pleading in them, no anger, just a deep, weary resignation. "Fine," she said. She stood up, her small frame looking impossibly fragile in the oversized chair. "If saving a life costs my career, I'll pay that price." Henderson cleared his throat, relieved it was this easy. "Effective immediately, your employment at St. Jude's Medical Center is terminated. Security will escort you from the premises." The walk of shame was a blur. Big Mike Garcia, the kindly 60-something security guard, met her at the conference room door. His face was etched with sympathy. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he murmured as they walked to the locker room. "This isn't right. Watch that blood pressure, Mike," she said, managing a faint smile. The other nurses wouldn't meet her eyes. They knew. They knew what had really happened in the trauma bay, but fear was a powerful silencer. They had families to feed and mortgages to pay. Sarah packed her belongings into a cardboard box. It didn't take long. A cracked coffee mug that said, "World's Okayest Nurse," a well-worn stethoscope she'd bought with her own money, a dying succulent plant, and at the bottom, a small frame photo of her late husband in his dress uniform. 2 decades of service to her country, a lifetime of medical expertise, reduced to a box that wouldn't fill the passenger seat of a car. Big Mike walked her to the main entrance. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, revealing a miserable, rain-swept Chicago night. The wind was cold, whipping the freezing rain sideways. "Take care of yourself," Mike said, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah nodded, pulling her thin jacket tighter around her shoulders. She stepped out into the storm, the door sliding shut behind her, sealing her out of the world she had dedicated her life to. Her car was in the shop, a repair she couldn't afford. The bus stop was 6 blocks away, She huddled under the flimsy shelter, the cardboard box on her lap getting soggier by the second. She carefully tilted it, trying to keep the rain off the photo of her husband. Rain plastered her graying hair to her forehead. Her bad knee, a souvenir from a hard landing in the Hindu Kush Mountains, began to throb in rhythm with the swishing windshield wipers of passing cars. It's over. The thought wasn't angry. It was just a heavy, suffocating fact. She'd end up as a greeter at a grocery store, another forgotten old woman with a story no one would ever know. She was just a nurse, an old stubborn nurse who didn't know her place. That's when she heard it. At first, it was just a low thrumming, a vibration she felt in her teeth more than heard, barely perceptible above the noise of the city and the storm. But it grew, steadily, insistently. Thwop, 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 the sound of rotors, heavy rotors, military. The puddles on the street began to ripple. The glass of the bus shelter rattled. The ground beneath her feet began to shake. Pedestrians on the sidewalk stopped, their umbrellas inverting as a powerful downdraft hit the street. They scattered, screaming, assuming it was a terrorist attack. Cars slammed on their brakes, creating a cacophony of screeching tires and blaring horns. Out of the dark, rain-swept clouds they descended. Two of them. UH-60. Black Hawk helicopters flying impossibly low, their searchlights cutting through the gloom. They didn't land on the hospital's helipad. One of them, with terrifying precision, landed directly in the middle of the intersection in front of the hospital, its rotors churning the rain into a miniature hurricane. The street was instantly flooded with a blinding sea of red and blue lights. Black SUVs, the kind with federal plates, screeched to a halt, boxing in the intersection. Men in dark suits and earpieces spilled out, weapons drawn, creating a perimeter. Olive-drab military Humvees flanked the entire scene. Sarah stared, clutching her box, her mind struggling to process the impossible scene unfolding before her. The rear door of the lead SUV opened. A man emerged, flanked by a wall of suits. He was tall, in his late 60s, with a shock of white hair and 4 silver stars gleaming on the shoulders of his dress uniform. He didn't run from the rain. He walked through it as if it didn't dare touch him. He carried a simple black cane, but he didn't lean on it. He wielded it like a scepter. General Tom Connolly, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. A man Sarah had last seen in a command tent in Bagram. A man whose life she had saved after a suicide bomber attack. He scanned the chaotic scene, his eyes sharp and focused. One of the Secret Service agents pointed, not at the hospital, but directly at the bus stop, directly at her. Target in rear. The agent's voice crackled through a dozen earpieces. General Connolly's head snapped in her direction. His stern, weathered face broke into a look of profound relief. He started walking towards her, his pace brisk, the agent scrambling to keep up. A young Army Ranger sprinted through the gridlocked traffic, dodging cars, his boots splashing through the deep puddles. He stopped in front of her, his face flushed, rain dripping from his helmet. He looked at the small, drenched woman and the soggy box. "Mom," he said, his voice a mixture of desperation and awe. "Lieutenant Colonel Miller, Mom, you need to come with us. Now." He reached for her arm, his grip firm but respectful. "Drop the box, Mom. We're going." Sarah looked down at the box, at the photo of her husband, at the dying plant. She looked up at the young ranger, at the descending helicopters, at the 4-star general now striding towards her. She clutched the box tighter. "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "The box comes with me." Inside St. Jude's, chaos of a different sort was erupting. Dr. Preston Sterling was holding an impromptu press conference in the hospital lobby. He stood before a hastily assembled bank of microphones, Harold Henderson hovering nervously at his side. The news of a high-value military patient had leaked, and the cameras had materialized out of thin air. Sterling was in his element, his voice smooth and authoritative, the picture of a heroic surgeon. It was a tense situation, to be sure, he was saying, adjusting his tie. The patient presented with multiple critical injuries, and quick thinking was paramount. We had a minor staffing issue, a nurse who became emotionally overwhelmed, but my team and I were able to regain control of the situation and perform the necessary life-saving procedures. The commander is now resting comfortably, thanks to the world-class care provided here at St. Jude's. He was mid-smirk when the main entrance doors burst open. General Tom Connolly strode in, flanked by Secret Service agents and 2 armed MPS. He was dripping wet, his face like a thunderhead, and he moved with an aura of absolute power that made the air in the lobby crackle. The reporters turned as one, a flock of birds sensing a predator. Cameras flashed, microphones swung towards the new arrival. Sterling's smile froze on his face. Henderson looked like he was about to faint. "General Connolly," a reporter shouted, "what brings you to St. Jude's?" The general ignored them. His eyes, cold and hard as chips of granite, were locked on Dr. Sterling. He stopped directly in front of the podium. "I was just watching your press conference on my way in, Doctor," Connolly said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Time to correct the record." He turned slightly, and the agents behind him parted. Standing there, looking small and drenched but with a spine of steel, was Sarah Miller. She was still clutching her soggy cardboard box. A collective gasp went through the assembled staff. Brenda O'Brien, who had come down to see the commotion, felt a chill run down her spine. Sterling's face went from pale to ghostly white. "General, I don't know what you think you saw, but this woman is a disgruntled ex-employee," he stammered, trying to regain control. "She was fired for assaulting me. She's mentally unstable." The general's eyes narrowed. "She was fired," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow louder than a shout, "for saving my son's life." Silence. A profound, shocked silence filled the lobby. The only sound was the frantic clicking of cameras. Connolly took a step closer to Sterling. "You just told the nation that this woman was unstable. You told them you saved the patient. You lied." He turned to one of his aides who handed him a slim black folder stamped with the Department of Defense seal. He opened it. "Do you know who Sarah Miller is, Doctor?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm. Was said. Sterling just stared, speechless. Connolly read from the file without looking at it, his eyes boring into Sterling's. "Retired Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Miller, 3 tours in Iraq, 4 in Afghanistan. Served as a senior trauma specialist with the Joint Special Operations Command. Recipient of the Silver Star for Gallantry in Action, the Bronze Star with Valor, and 2 Purple Hearts." He paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. "She's legendary in the Special Operations community. They call her Dusty, because she's the one you want by your side when everything turns to dust. She's credited with saving over 200 lives in combat conditions that would make this pristine trauma." "Bay of yours look like a day spa," he snapped the folder shut. "The Yetzoli." Her shaky hands, nerve damage from holding a soldier's artery closed with her bare hands for 6 hours, her slow movement, a shattered knee from a mortar blast in Kandahar when she used her own body to shield a wounded Marine. He pointed the folder at Sterling like a weapon. "I've reviewed the telemetry data from the ambulance and the security footage from your trauma bay. A first-year combat medic in a muddy ditch would have spotted that tension pneumothorax. You missed it. You were focused on a superficial bleeder while my son was suffocating. And when this woman, this hero, tried to save him, you assaulted her." Sterling crumpled. It wasn't a physical collapse, but a spiritual one. The arrogant, polished veneer shattered, revealing the terrified, incompetent fraud beneath. He started sweating, his tie suddenly too tight, his eyes darting around for an escape that wasn't there. This is an exaggeration," he sputtered. "A misunderstanding. My father, Congressman Sterling." "Your father is on the phone with the Secretary of Defense as we speak," Connolly cut him off coldly. explaining how his family's donations to this hospital have been used to cover up a pattern of malpractice and insurance fraud that a federal investigation is about to uncover. The general turned his furious gaze on the trembling Harold Henderson. As for you, you are the administrator of this facility. You fired the most qualified trauma specialist on the Eastern Seaboard based on the word of this child. Henderson, realizing the ship was sinking and taking everyone with it, made his calculation. He abandoned his captain without a second thought. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a pre-written letter. "Dr. Sterling," he said, his voice shaking, "effective immediately. Your privileges at this hospital are suspended. Your employment is terminated pending the results of a federal investigation." Then he turned to Sarah, his face a grotesque mask of sycophantic pleading. "Colonel Miller. Sarah, there has been a terrible mistake. Please. We would like to offer you any position you desire. Director of Nursing Operations, Chief of Trauma Training, name your terms." Sarah looked at the groveling administrator, at the broken doctor, at the flashing cameras. She said nothing. It was Big Mike Garcia who delivered the final, perfect moment of karmic justice. He stepped forward from the crowd of staff, holding an empty cardboard box. He walked right up to the stunned Preston Sterling and held it out. "I believe you know the way out, Doctor," Big Mike said, his voice clear and steady, laced with a grim satisfaction that was shared by every nurse, orderly and technician in the room. "Here's a box for your things. It's a bit small, but I'm sure you'll manage." Sterling stared at the box as if it were a venomous snake. He stumbled away from the podium, out into the pouring rain, without a coat, without an umbrella, his perfect world shattered into a million pieces around him. The cameras followed him, their flashes illuminating his pathetic, rain-soaked retreat. General Connolly turned to Sarah. His hard face softened. "You look like hell, Dusty," he said gently. Sarah looked down at the soggy box in her hands, then back up at her old friend. A small, weary smile touched her lips for the first time in weeks. "You should see the other guy," she said. 1 year later, the sun shone brightly on the dedication ceremony for the new Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Dusty Miller Center for Pediatric and Combat Trauma at St. Jude's. The toxic hierarchy was gone, dismantled piece by piece. Harold Henderson had been forced into early retirement. Preston Sterling, his medical license permanently revoked, had been last seen working at a cosmetic Botox clinic in a strip mall in Ohio, his name tag reading Prezi. Sarah, now the hospital's director of patient care and safety, stood at a podium. She wasn't wearing oversized scrubs, but a tailored suit. The severe bun was gone, replaced by a professional, stylish haircut. She looked not younger, but more herself. In the front row, General Tom Connolly sat smiling, his son beside him, a faint scar on his neck, the only visible reminder of that night. The entire hospital staff was there, standing taller, their faces filled not with fear, but with pride. Brenda O'Brien, now Sarah's second-in-command, winked at her from the crowd. "They told me this center is named after me because of one night," Sarah said into the microphone, her voice no longer a quiet rasp, but clear and strong, carrying across the assembled crowd. "But it's not. It's named for a promise. A promise that the person doing the work matters more than the person with the title. A promise that competence will always matter more than connections. And a promise to every nurse, every technician, every single person in this hospital. If you have to break a rule to save a life, you do it. I will have your back, because the patient comes first, always." As the applause thundered, a young rookie nurse approached her nervously, chart in hand. "Director Miller, I'm sorry to bother you, but I have a question about this patient's protocol." Sarah looked at the young woman's face, saw her own uncertainty from years ago reflected there. She smiled, a real warm smile. She took the chart. It's Sarah, she said. And there are no bad questions. Let's take a look together. And that is the incredible true story of Sarah Dusty Miller. It's crazy to think that she was fired for saving a life just minutes before a 4-star general needed her to do exactly that. It really makes you wonder how many heroes are out there right now getting punished for doing the right thing just because it breaks a protocol. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more real-life dramas about heroes getting the justice they deserve, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story. Drop a comment below telling me what you think should have happened to Dr. Sterling. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.